So good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to Trasna Natira. I'm Conor Dullahan, a collector, and I run a Facebook group called Early Irish Militaria. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for our speaker tonight, feel free to add them to the chat box and we will get to them towards the end. So just like to introduce tonight's speaker, Kieran McMullen. And Kieran, he's retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel with 22 years of service, including 2 wars as a field artillery officer, 14 years in law enforcement, and he's a trained shooting reconstructionist. He's an author and an inventor. Kieran has a bachelor's BA of Arts in Irish history. And so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Kieran.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Connor. And I'm really happy to be here and be able to talk about 2 of my favorite subjects, Ireland and guns. The Easter Rising is really a great starting point in talking about the guns and what the capabilities were. And the reason I wrote this original book was because I found a misunderstanding among people about the capabilities of weapons and how they were employed and how they were used, and what they could do and what they couldn't do. And this is basically a primer, if you will, on weapons used during the Easter Rising. This is Murphy's first rule of combat. And I know there's a number of veterans probably out there, and you all know this if anybody does, that if you're within range of the enemy is within range of you. And this is obviously a staged picture that was taken later on during the 16 Rising. And you can see the soldiers in the background standing guard. And you'll notice that these, the Lewis gun, the Lewis machine gun, and the rifles, these are effective weapons much more in open spaces than they are in confined spaces. And we're going to talk about effective range and what that means and the difference between urban fighting, which is really pistol, grenade, carbine range, versus the countryside, which is something that is much more relevant when we get into the War of Independence. So let's take a look at the combatants. The British have fairly unskilled soldiers at this point. In fact, the British have a problem with even loading their weapons. You all know the stories about the troops, the landing at Dunleary. They get them off the boat, they stand them on the side of the docks, and they have to teach them literally how to load their weapons. This is going to be a huge detriment to them later on. These are just unskilled soldiers. And the reason for that, of course, is the high loss rate in the Great War, which is going on in France. The Irish, however, have a great advantage in this one skill. They've been training for 2.5 years for this very day, for this week. They've practiced marksmanship, and we're going to talk about how they got to do that and how it was actually the British who allowed them to train in marksmanship. Another thing we should mention is that the tactics of the British were not all that good. Their strategy was excellent. The reverse is true for the Irish. The strategy, because of the call-off, is hampered greatly. But their tactics are excellent. And again, this is going to be because they've been training for 2.5 years, something the British were not able to do. The weapons they're going to be using, Handguns are one of the primary weapons. You'll notice in these two pictures, one is a semi-automatic pistol, that's the Browning, and the other is a Webley revolver. These are the two basic types of handguns that are going to be used. The difference between them, of course, is the revolver can have 6, 7, 8, 9 shots, depending on the type of revolver. This particular is a Mark 6 Webley, and it has 6 shots. Then it has to be broken open and reloaded 1 bullet at a time. The semi-automatic weapon, the Browning, uses a magazine, a removable box magazine, and it's 1 pull of the trigger, fires 1 bullet. That's what makes it a semi-automatic. If it was automatic, as it's commonly called, which is a misnomer, it would be 1 pull of the trigger and the bullets keep going. The pistol, the Webley, is a double action or single action pistol. What that means is single action is you cock the hammer with your thumb, you pull the trigger and it drops the hammer. Double action is you pull the trigger, it cocks the hammer and then drops it to fire the round. Now, people very commonly say, oh, the semi-automatic is not as reliable as the revolver. That's not completely true. If you'll notice at the bottom of the base of the cylinder, there's a little shadow you'll see there. That is what's called a cylinder stop. That's what keeps the chambers in the cylinder aligned with the barrel so it can be fired. If that cylinder stop malfunctions, the cylinder does not align. You may not hit the primer with the hammer. You may shave, it may go off, and you may shave lead back at yourself. And also we'll talk about dirt. Dirt is a major factor with the Webley handgun. Another semi-automatic pistol, very common among the volunteers. This is the C96 Mauser. It was the first really successful semi-automatic pistol to come on the market. A favorite of Churchill in the Boer War. Millions of these were made. They were made in Germany, they were made in Spain, they were made in China. It has a fixed box magazine, meaning it loads from the top. As you can see there in the picture, a 10-round stripper clip, you take your thumb and you press the 10 rounds down the stripper clip and into the box magazine. Very effective weapon. With the shoulder stock, very accurate at 300 yards. It essentially then becomes a carbine. As I said, this is probably the first really successful one. There was earlier ones like a bore shot pistol, which was a semi-automatic, but it just wasn't as successful. Another thing I should mention is when you're talking about handguns, you're talking about short distance fighting. You're talking about urban terrain. The average gunfight, according to the FBI, is 8.5 feet. Your sights mean nothing at 8.5 feet. 8.5 feet is point and shoot. So that's what handguns are for, point and shoot. This particular weapon is different in the fact that once you add the stock, you have gone to about a 300-yard capability. And I admit my ignorance. I'm an American. I don't know how many meters that is. Anyway, this is the first really successful one. Very, very popular. Very good weapon. Let's go back to the Webley for a moment. 300,000 of these are made during the war. It comes out in 1915. They're absolutely ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Officers have them. The #1 and the #2 men in a Lewis machine gun team has them. Bombers have them. So it's a very common weapon. If you're going to appropriate one from somebody, a pistol that is, this is one you would very likely get. It's a .455 caliber, which is a slow-moving, very heavy bullet. If you're hit, you know it. You'll see in the left-hand slide the star-shaped pattern that's the ejector for the spent cartridges. This is what's critical with this gun. If you get dirt underneath that star pattern ejector, it won't close properly, the cylinder will lock up, and basically you have a stone. So Webleys, very fine weapons, but very susceptible to dirt. I'll mention something else, and this is kind of a problem from a training aspect, and that is when training, people have a tendency to catch their empty cartridges. And you'll see people on the ranges, they'll empty the cartridges, empty cartridges into their hand, they'll put them in their pocket, whatever. A very dangerous practice. When you break it open, just let the cartridges go. They're of no use to you anymore. There's a very famous case in California, 2 police officers killed. They each had pocketfuls of empty cartridges. They were taking the time to break open their weapons, grab the empty cartridges and put them in their pocket. So a training issue. This is just one semi-automatic. This is the 1903 Colt pocket pistol. You'll notice that there's no external hammer. That's because the hammer is internal. Basically, you have 3 types of semi-automatics. You have external hammers, internal hammers, and striker fired. When somebody says they have a hammerless, that means they have a gun that the hammer is included underneath the shroud on the back of the handgun. The 1903 was a very popular pocket pistol. It's light, it's easy to carry. It's 32 caliber, which is the same caliber as the Webley Scotts that the semi-automatics that the DMP G Division and the RIC and actually uniformed DMP would eventually have. So this is a very good, another Browning invention, excellent gun, highly reliable, and very common. This is, it's one fault as far as I'm concerned is if you'll notice on the bottom of the grip, there's a release, a catch. That's called a European style catch. You have to use 2 hands to extract the magazine, unlike the American system where you push a button and the magazine drops out. This is a little slower to reload, but you'll find it on the battlefield out there. Long guns. This is the weapon of every soldier. Every man, as the Marines say, a rifleman. This is not as simple as you would think. It's not just look down the barrel. Every shooter knows that when you're looking down the sights of the gun, you can only focus on one thing. Your eye will only focus on one thing, and yet you're looking at a target, you're looking at a front sight, you're looking at a rear sight. So what do? When you look down the barrel of the rifle, you look at the target, you put the front sight on the target, and you allow the fuzzed rear sight to come up and align with the front sight. If you trust your body, it will do it. It will do it naturally. So that's what you do. You focus on your target. You also, the critical thing here is range estimation. And let's talk about effective range for a minute. Range estimation is critical. You have to know how far away your target is in order to pick the right sight picture. Most combat rifles at the time have a sight that's called a battle sight. You'll see this, the leaf on the rifle, on the rear of the rifle, a leaf sight that lays flat. It's usually a notch with a post on the front sight. That is the battle sight, and it's normally aligned for 300 yards. So anything within 300 yards, you put your front sight on and align your rear sight, you should be hitting it. Beyond that, then you have to say, okay, I believe my target is 600 yards. You have to raise the leaf sight and adjust it. So range estimation is very important. Most of the fighting in Dublin, at least, will be within battle sight range. So in this particular deal, it's not a problem. Murphy's 7th rule of combat. Professionals are predictable. It's the amateurs that are dangerous. That's an absolute truth. The British learned it with the Boers. The British would learn it again with the Irish, especially at Mount Street Bridge. They had a system, and that system was adhered to strictly, and that system failed them because they failed to adapt. The amateur usually knows his terrain, he knows what he wants to do, and he knows his capabilities. 1905 comes, the Boer War is over, and there's a Major McMahon who decides, you know, if there's anything we learned, it's that we can't shoot. And we sure can't shoot against the Boers, who are hunters and woodsmen and farmers who use their weapons every day. And so there becomes in 1905 a very serious concentration on we've got to learn how to shoot. And they do. Marksmanship comes up in the British Army. It comes up very strongly. There's the famous Mad Minute, which is series 22 of Table B, which is they give them 15 rounds. You've got 1 minute to fire 15 rounds and score 12 hits on a target at 300 yards. The target is actually 3 feet across. So it's bigger than a man. So you can still miss the silhouette of the man, and if you're within the 3 feet, you've still got a score. But the record then becomes 38 well-aimed shots, as it's called, all on the target, all within the 3 feet. 38 shots, 1 minute. A Sergeant Snoxall, who was a firearms instructor. Absolute incredible feat. Nobody's ever done the same thing again. And also, it becomes important, this marksmanship becomes important because the British decide, well, to get people to do well, we'll pay them more. So if you qualify with your rifleman's tab, you get an extra 6 pence a day. That's almost 3 shillings a month. That's a fair amount of money. So the soldiers are incentivized to learn how to shoot. Now remember, this is 1905, moving towards the Great War. This is the professional army that we're talking about. Another attempt is made by 2 civilians in order to improve marksmanship. Both of them are out in South Africa in the Boer War. Both of them see how poorly the marksmanship is, how poor the marksmanship is among the British Army. Rudyard Kipling is a reporter, and Arthur Conan Doyle serving with the hospital that he puts together and takes to South Africa. So they come back and they establish miniature rifle clubs. They establish 1,900 clubs across the United Kingdom. Well, it does improve people's marksmanship. People do go to the ranges. People are practicing. But Ireland's part of the United Kingdom at this point. And so what that allows is, that allows Irish volunteers, Irish Citizen Army, other groups, the Hibernians, to also avail themselves of this ability. The firearms laws go out of effect in 1907 in Ireland to a major extent. weapons become available. So the British have allowed this to actually happen and improve the marksmanship, thinking only of, we will have trained people for our army. Well, there's more than one army. So they used 22 caliber rifles. They use what are called Morris tubes, which are caliber devices. You take a regular 45 caliber rifle and you do a tubular insert and you use a subcaliber, a 32 or a 22 or whatever. But Rudyard Kipling and Arthur Conan Doyle actually helped in the establishment of the capabilities of the volunteers. By 1916, all those men who the British had who could shoot have gone to the front. The first line troops, the reserves, territorials, all those well-trained people have been decimated in the first 2 years of the war. So now with Kitchener's new army, marksmanship is still done, but it's not done well, and it's rushed. And so the British Army in 1916 is back to where they were when they were trying to fight the Boers. They've lost sight of the importance of proper training. The colonials haven't. This is a part of the recruiting system for the Australians. And as you can see, if you were highly skilled in the use of weapons, you could be accepted even if you had minor ailments, because they knew the importance of rifle marksmanship to the Army, into what was going on. This picture here is a picture of Sergeant Nevin. If you remember the story of the tin can that was stretched across what was then Sackville Street from the GPO to Cleary's to the hotel, and the tin can was used to send messages back and forth, and tin can got shot out of the air, and they decided then they would just tie the papers to the rope and take it across. It was Sergeant Nevin who had about, my estimation was 1,060 feet, shot the tin can out of the air. So the man knew what he was doing. The Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and later the Americans, all very practiced, very hard on marksmanship. The Irish Volunteers and the ICA take their training seriously. And again, I go back to since 1914, 1915, they're practicing, they know what they're doing. They have people who know what they're doing. They're for a penny, you can get 3 rounds and go practice. They're doing it all the time. And in all the practicing, all the skills that they learn with the 22 calibers and the subcaliber devices are transferable to their full-size or full-bore weapons. Some of their tutors, Captain Jack White, the O'Reilly. The O'Reilly was famous for giving lectures on weapons, their cleaning, how to use them, how to care for them. Conley, not only very proficient with the weapons, but of course, teaching about fighting in urban terrain, and he shares that training with the Irish Volunteers. Shooting discipline is critical. Well, what do they have to shoot? One of the principal weapons is the Hoth Mauser, the German model 1871, 11 millimeter, big bore. This is a true rifle, meaning it's long. It has a fairly low muzzle velocity. It's a single shot, which means there's no magazine to the weapon. You open the bolt, You put in one bullet, you close the bolt. When that's fired, you open the bolt, put in one bullet. It's black powder. Now, this is critical because black powder gives your location away. And if there's anything people don't like, it's for you to attract attention to their position. And that's what you're doing every time you fire the weapon. A cloud of black smoke comes out. Your enemy knows exactly where you are. These weapons were actually still in use in Germany in World War I. They were in reserve units back in Germany. The railroad guards had them. So they were still being used. But when they got to, the volunteers got their 1,500 weapons, they really only got enough ammunition for these rifles for 33 rounds per weapon. That's not much. That's not a lot to go to war with. And when they're gone, they're gone. You can't get the replacement ammunition. So very important weapon. It gave them the ability to train. It gave them something to fight with. But it definitely has its problems. Besides the smoke, there's another problem the Germans, I'm sure, never told them about. And by the way, these were bought, I believe, from the same company, Benny Spiro, that sold weapons to Edward Carson and company. So what happens when the barrel on a Hoth Mauser heats up, you fire about 3 rounds and the barrel starts to get hot. When the barrel on this weapon gets hot, you end up with a condition called a wandering zero. What that means is the 4th round out is going right, and you don't know where it's going right. The barrel, when heated, has a tendency to throw the rounds off to one side. Not good when you're trying to hit a particular target. The short magazine Lee Enfield, #1 Mark III. Most prolific weapon on the battlefield. It is a short magazine Lee Enfield. Short meaning it's longer than a carbine, it's shorter than a rifle. It's magazine fed, but the magazine itself is fed from the top. In the bottom left, you'll see what looks like a C, piece of steel with a C in it. That is what's called the loading bridge. And the charging clip on the right is what goes into that charging bridge, and the 5 rounds are stripped from that clip into the magazine. Many times in movies and things, you'll see people, they'll pull the magazine out and look at it. Well, not done. You've only got 1 magazine. You never take it out of the rifle except to clean it, and you load it always from the top. Loads quickly, fires quickly, easy to use, easy to maintain, an excellent weapon, extremely accurate. And it fires the Mark 6 round and the Mark 7 round, and that's going to become important later. The RIC carbine, also out there on the battlefield. The RIC carbine is a true carbine. It's short. It's shorter than the short magazine Lee Enfield. And it's lightweight, easy to carry. It gets a bayonet, which is very unusual for carbine. And it was the weapon of the RIC. You'll notice in the bottom right, it's got a dust cover on top of the bolt. Why? Because they expect them to be out in the field, on horseback, on bicycle, whatever. They expect dirt. They want to keep the bolt clean. They want to keep the mechanism working. Also in the bottom right, you'll see a nub right above the stock and below the bolt. That is actually a cutoff. This weapon has a 6-round box magazine. You load it singly, one bullet at a time into the magazine. You push in that cutoff, and you use the weapon as a single shot rifle. You fire one round, you open it up, you load another, you fire it again. If you get in a tight position, you've got a problem, then you pull that tab out and it lets the 6 rounds of the magazine feed up one at a time. So that's important. Another thing that's going to be important is this does not shoot the Mark 7 bullet that the Army is using. The Mark 7 is used for machine guns. For the SMLE, it's not the same bullet. It's a 303. You can fire either one in either weapon, but it's going to be the wrong bullet. So this uses a Mark 6 round. There's just a plethora of other weapons out there that the Irish are using. Martini Enfields. They gain 100 Martini Enfields by stealing them from the National Volunteers off the docks. There's Krag Jorgensen, which is a side-loading rifle, which is also there. The Vitelli Italian rifle, Carson has imported thousands of these. The Redmond imports them. They're 10.4 caliber. They're out there. That's the weapon without ammunition that the Gorgeous Rex were carrying when they were fired on at Mount Street. The Charger Magazine Lee Enfield is just an older version of the Enfield. It also shoots Mark 6 rounds, as the Martini Enfield does. And then shotguns are everywhere. Why? Because they're easy to access, easy to get a hold of. Every farm probably has one. Machine gun. The machine gun most prevalent that shows up is the Lewis machine gun, gas operated, air cooled. The Belgian rattlesnake, as they called it, American by design, produced originally in Belgium and then by the British. It's a good weapon. It has a rate of fire between 300 and 600 rounds per minute. You can change the gas port to change how fast it fires. Normally, you only fire it in 3-round to 5-round bursts. It's man portable. There's one man carries the gun, and you're going to have up to 8 men traveling with him, hopefully. But this weapon is very dirt sensitive. In fact, this weapon is so dirt sensitive that if you're a Lewis machine gunner, you are excluded from all other duties so that you can keep your Lewis machine gun clean at all times. 80,000 of these will be produced in the Great War. They're turning them out at a rate of 800 a week by 1916. This shows you the insides of that Lewis gun. You notice in the top a set of cooling fins around the barrel. The way this gun works is air. It's cooled by air. You have to keep the barrel cool, or as the barrel heats, it will literally droop. And so where you're shooting is not where the bullets are going. The bullets are going into the ground short of that because the barrel is drooping. So you've got to keep it cool. At the bottom there, you'll see a tube, a long tube. That radiator type fin assembly with the barrel in the middle goes into that tube. And when you fire, the gases expelled from the muzzle of the weapon draw air from the back of the weapon inside the tube along those radiator fins and keep the weapon cool. A pretty unique design. You don't have to do that if you're flying an airplane. It's nice and cold up there. It's but on the ground, this is absolutely critical to keep the weapon functioning. Part of the functioning of this weapon is the rotary magazine. It's called a pan magazine. It fits on top. You can see here the top view and the bottom view. You can see by the bottom view where the bullets are loaded that it's open. And that's part of the problem with the gun. That's part of the reason it's got to be kept clean. Dirt is accessible to that entire inside of that magazine. So it's critical that that stay clean, or the weapon will jam up. In fact, there are 12 different quick action drills for the crew of a Lewis gun in order to get it back into operation in case it jams. But the most normal jam will be you've got dirt in the magazine. You also notice that the stubs all the way around the magazine, the outside of the magazine. Most magazines just push bullets up. This magazine is actually part of the weapon. It's actually part of the mechanism. As it turns, there's two appendages that come out and actually lock onto those nubs to make sure that the magazine is aligned in order to properly feed the next bullet into the weapon. So absolutely critical that, as I said, that all this stays clean. This is a normal Lewis gun crew. One Lewis gunner, and he's carrying a Webley. The number 2 man, and he's carrying a Webley. The number 2 man carries enough spare parts to almost assemble another Lewis gun. That was kind of a running joke in the Lewis gun crews, but it was absolutely true. Except for the receiver, he had almost everything. The rest of the men in the crew pass ammunition magazines forward, pass empty magazines back, and reload right there in the field. Also present were Vickers machine guns, belt-fed 250 round belt. Again, the Mark 7 ammunition. So you've got Vickers, you got Lewis, you got rifles, all of them using the same ammunition, all the Mark 7s. This is an improvement on another American invention, the Hiram Maxim, the Maxim machine gun. Vickers bought into it and made some improvements on it. For some reason, Americans are fascinated by machine guns, I guess. Supposedly there was one in the lobby of the Shelburne Hotel. I don't know how true that is. I've never seen that definitively. But this weapon fires 450 to 500 rounds a minute. So you go through a lot of belts of ammunition. It's water cooled. Just like the Lewis gun used air to cool its barrel, this one uses that water jacket that you see around it to cool. And that can at the bottom with the hose is a condenser. As the barrel heats up and starts to steam the water, it condenses into that can so you can reuse the water. Very reliable machine gun, very heavy, 51 pounds, hard to move, pretty much a defensive weapon. It'll be set up in one spot and you're not gonna wanna move it if you can help it. Unlike the Lewis gun, which is one man carry, and you can move it basically wherever you want. This is a position, a Vickers position from 1916. Obviously staged a picture, but you can see how it's in a defensive position right there. It's sitting on what's called a elevating mechanism, traversing an elevating mechanism, and it can fire 10,000 rounds without a malfunction. Highly reliable, puts out scads of bullets, normally fired 5 to 20 rounds at a time. You would fire, you would move over, you would fire, you would move over based on a particular range. So yeah, and it's got a crew of 6 to 8 basically. Artillery. This is what got me started on knowing what's going on with weapons during the Easter Rising. Basically, you have 3 different types of artillery that show up. You have the 18-pounder gun, the 12-pounder quick fire, and the 6-pounder quick fire. And they're all going to come from different places. You'll notice that all of them are called a gun, and they're pounders. I know you always see an 18-pound gun. The gun doesn't weigh 18 pounds. It's an 18-pounder. And we're gonna talk about what they're shooting and how they're used. And the 6-pounder is a quick fire, and the quick fire really refers to the type of breech that it has. It's open and closed quickly. and it uses either fixed or semi-fixed ammunition, which means there's a casing and there's a shell. And the 6-pounder, this particular one would have come off of the Persian Empire, which was a ship that was down in Dunleary in the harbor. I know sometimes you'll see that it came off the Helga, but I'm convinced it is in fact the one that was taken from the Persian Empire and was put on a cart and taken and used against Boland's Mill. They fired 88 rounds. They also came close to the Helga, as you all know, and the Helga got to fire back thinking that the volunteers had cannon. Infantry does not stand up well to cannon, and this particular type weapon had high explosive shell as well as shrapnel, and I'll explain the shrapnel in a little bit. I know that shrapnel is normally used as any kind of shell fragment, but it's actually a very specific type of round. The 18-pounder, this is a gun that 6,500 yards it can fire, and it's got fixed ammunition. The recoil system is a spring and buffer, which means it compresses and then it returns, but it also has to be stabilized by having its trail, the pole trail, put in one spot. And the reason that has to happen is if you don't, the recoil will move the cannon, and when you put it back in position, your position will never be the same, so you'll always be trying to fire the first shot of the day for the third or fourth or fifth time because you're not adjusting from where you were, you're adjusting from a new location. I'm going to talk for a minute again about the 18-pounder and the problem that it has. This is a picture taken obviously from onto the south side of the Liffey, looking towards the GPO. I'm sure you can see the GPO in the distance. Now, picture yourself as a cannon crew, and I know this has a slight elevation, but you're on the ground. Picture yourself on the ground. There's a slight elevation here, but disregard it. And you're trying to hit the GPO. Now, we all know how big a building the GPO is. It's huge, but I can't see it. All I can see is those columns and part of the front of the building. So what am I shooting at? Well, I'm shooting at something in between the Metropole Hotel and the other side of Henry Street. And I don't know exactly what I'm shooting at. Well, okay, let's move a couple 18-pounders to the other side. So here I am in Parnell Square, and there's the GPO down the right side of the street. And well, what am I shooting at? About all I can see are the columns of the GPO again. So this is a real problem. I can't lob shells in because I don't have a point to aim at, and I'm firing a gun. And this is the difference. All three of those weapons were guns, which means they have a flat trajectory. They don't have a lot of elevation. They have a high muzzle velocity, and they shoot very straight. If I wanted to hit the GPO, I needed a howitzer, or more importantly, I should have had a mortar. So I'm using a gun to try and lob shells at something I can't see and I can't adjust on. And so I'm having a very, very difficult time. That's one of the reasons that the volunteers will be able to hold out. Most of what's happening is happening to the front of the building, and it's the occasional hit on the building that's going to cause the real damage and set the fires. And this is what I mean about I can't really see what I'm what I'm shooting at. I'm trying to lob a shell into something between two buildings. This is what's called a dispersion pattern. So I'm going to guess at the spot, and we'll call that mean point of impact the spot I'm guessing I'm shooting at. And I'm going to lob the shell in, and normal dispersion will say that half the rounds will go past, half the rounds will fall short, half the rounds will go right, half the rounds will go left. And I don't really know where it hit. So I'm guessing at what's happening. Had they been able to use a howitzer or a mortar, the effect they would have had with their artillery would have been much greater. And this is what they're firing. The 12-pounder and the 6-pounder, the 12-pounder, of course, is the one from the Helga that fired on the Liberty Hall and hit Butt Bridge and had to adjust. And again, the problem there is they're trying to fire under the bridge to hit Liberty Hall, and it's a gun. It's shooting straight, it's shooting flat. They're not being able to lob it. The gun that are 12-pounders and 6-pounders, they have high explosive shells. They can do serious damage. The 18-pounder has none. They don't have it available. There are no incendiary rounds. There are no high explosive rounds. What they do have is shrapnel rounds. And what shrapnel is, as you can see in the illustration on the left, it's like having a shotgun that goes off downrange for you. A case shot is like having a giant shotgun at the muzzle of your cannon. When you fire it, hundreds of antimony lead balls come out of the muzzle and spread. Well, Major Shrapnel, a British officer, decided that he wanted that same thing to happen downrange. And so he came up with the round that's named after him. And what happens is when you fire a shrapnel round, it goes a particular time. You have to set the time, which would equate to distance. In the base, you'll see what's called the loose black powder, diaphragm, etc. The fuse on the front goes off, a train of powder goes down, sets off the charge in the base, and this hollow shell filled with hundreds of antimony balls goes off, blows out the front, and you have your shotgun effect downrange. So not only do you have the speed of the shell going downrange, when the time is up and the internal explosion occurs, it pushes all those lead antimony ball out in this giant shotgun effect that gives greater speed to it and is devastating on infantry. It's devastating on infantry in the open. What it's not devastating on is infantry in a protected position like the GPO with the stone and the masonry around it. So they're constantly firing the shrapnel. One thing that it does have, when the charge goes off in the base, that can have an incendiary effect if it's close enough to something that's flammable. It's something that happens. That's just a picture of, you can still see it there at the GPO, it's still there. Edged weapons don't really play a huge part. You have pikes, swords, bayonets. Those are really half pikes that soldier are carrying. A real pike is 16 feet. They're used against horses. These are half pikes are used as a bayonet on a rifle would be used. Cold steel, very effective. Psychological effect. I myself have stood guard in front of an embassy with steel. It has an effect if they understand you're willing to use it. You've seen the picture on the bottom right a million times in the GPO. You may not have noticed there's something wrong with that picture, and I'll show you what that is in a second. The first time I saw this picture, I thought, something wrong, and sure enough, there was. And that gives you a better look at it. the volunteers had been given German rifles and French bayonets. And if you draw a line from up the barrel, you'll notice that those bayonets, if you use your bayonet, it crosses the muzzle, you can't shoot. Swords, there's not a sword in this group. In 1915, there was a general order in the British Army on active service, swords would never be carried. They're not useful anymore. Explosives mainly used, Mills bombs, improvised explosives devices, gelignite, damage capability, improvised explosives, depends on what you're using. You see a lot of the pictures with the tin cans that were used. In fact, black powder is shipped in tin cans with a soldered seam because black powder it does not explode, it burns, and it just expands the tin. So those type of bombs that were used by the volunteers were much more concussion type thing, not going to do a lot of damage. The number 5 Mills bomb, very effective, had a lot of capability, has a 100-yard bursting radius. The average person could throw it 39 yards. They could throw it 49 feet effectively and it exactly hit your target. And the important thing about this is, obviously, if it's got an effective range of 100 yards, the idea is to throw it and duck. These were very heavily used, of course, at Mount Street, at the South Dublin Union, at the Mendicity. They become very important. And once again, I would call them grenadiers, but the bombers would be carrying Webley pistols. The bomb team was made up of an NCO, 2 throwers, 2 carriers, 2 bayonet men, and I don't know about you, but I would not want to be called one of the 2 spares. Just somehow that seems inappropriate, but that's what they were called. And basically, everybody carried extra grenades. There's a difference between deflagrate or detonate, and it's fairly simple explanation. Something deflagrates if it burns at less than the speed of sound, and it moves by heat. It detonates if it moves greater than the speed of sound, and it moves by shockwave. And that was the problem at the magazine fort. They had gelignite. Gelignite is a low order explosive. They couldn't get into the magazine where they wanted to detonate the ammunition. They had no ability to drill into the walls. You only get a sympathetic explosion, as it's called, in other words, detonating other explosives by shockwave. They couldn't do it. So it was a good attempt, but they couldn't make it happen. Ammunition's overall, it's a critical operation. The British supply problem, it looks simple, but it's actually complicated. The Irish supply system looks complicated, but it's actually simple. The Irish supply system is you use what you got. And they understood very well, because they've been training for 2 years, of the importance of the right ammunition in the right weapons. The British will actually show up at Dunleary with the wrong ammunition for their rifles, but that's okay because they don't know how to load the rifles. They actually show up with the Mark VI. Here you'll see the Mark V round, the Mark VI round, the Mark VII round, and the Mauser, and a shotgun shell. What's important is going to be the Mark V round was outlawed by the Hague Convention. The British are not allowed to use it. They had to take it out of service. However, they dump hundreds of thousands of rounds in Ireland with the RIC for training. It is a hollow point, which means it's an expanding bullet. People will call it dum-dum. People will call it an exploding bullet. And there is such a thing as an exploding bullet. This is not it, though. And that's going to cause a problem later. The Mark 6 bullet only has 31 grains of powder. It's got a 215 grain bullet, and it's used in the carbines and the Martini Henrys, or excuse me, the Martini Enfields. The Mark 7 round is used in the SMLE, the Lewis guns, the Vickers guns, etc. It's got 39 grains of cordite and 174 grain bullet, and so there's a huge difference. If you use the Mark 6 round in a rifle, you're not going to hit what you're aiming at. If you use a Mark 7 in a carbine, you're not going to hit what you're aiming at. They're two different velocities, two different bullet weights, which means two different sights. The Mauser Model 71, caliber 11 millimeter, heavy lead bullet, hadn't been used in 20 years in combat. This is just a chart. Just look at, all you need to look at is the green and the black. It's the difference between the Mark 6 and the Mark 7, and you can see that the trajectories are not the same. And that means that the bullets don't go in the same place. Murphy's first law of ballistics: small bullets may expand, but big bullets never shrink. So what does that mean? That's got to do with the dum-dum question they were accused of using. On the right is a Mark 7 or Mark 5 bullet. You can see it's a hollow point, and there's lots of this in the, as I say, in the RIC barracks across the country. And so if you took an RIC barracks, would that be some of the ammunition you took? Almost undoubtedly. So do you use it? Probably. The bullet, the Mark 7 bullet, has its own problems, and it's actually much more devastating as a wound than the Mark 5. The Mark 5 will expand and make a big channel, but the Mark 7 bullet is base heavy. It's got aluminum or paper in the front of the bullet. It's very accurate, but that means since it's base heavy, when it hits something, it tumbles, and it makes the wound a lot worse. So while the Hague Convention wanted to go to complete copper-covered bullets that were small in caliber and would do less damage, they actually did the opposite. This is a wound channel for a 303. You can see what's called a temporary cavity and the permanent cavity. Temporary cavity is basically done by shock wave and will just contract right back. The permanent cavity, when it hits, the bullet starts to tumble and tears an irregular shape wound in the target. Very hard to treat. In fact, this is a cousin of ours, Patrick Murray. He was wounded in a charge up Moore Street. You can see he had an entry wound on the side of his leg, of his calf, but the exit wound was on the back. That's because the bullet actually tumbled inside his leg. This is a 10.4 Vertelli round, the 11 millimeter of the almost identical, a single uniform size cavity, which means this wound is much easier to treat. So even though the cavity is bigger all the way along, it's easier for the medical profession to deal with. So they'll call this a dum-dum. It's not. It's just a good performing round. This is Murphy's 10th law. There is no single solution to weapons problems. Every time you think you've got it solved, some 12-year-old will explain to you what you've missed. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that I've explained some of the problems, especially that the Cannon artillery had with trying to interdict the GPO and other targets. And Connor, I leave it up to you.
Kieran,
I
thank you
want to
very
thank
much.
everybody for being here.
Thank you so much. All right. We have a bunch of stuff coming in on chat here. So Kieran, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure can.
All right. So let me just start here, go through some of these, cognizant of time here. So one of the nice things too, Kieran, is these questions are available. So Liam will be able to send them on to you. So if we don't get through them all, compliments from Marcus, obviously a big fan, and you guys have worked hand in hand on a bunch of projects, but excellent talk. Styles and capabilities of weapons and weaponry almost always get lost by academia. I think question is, were the weapons used by the small group of Irish volunteers superior or similar to that of the Sherwood Foresters at the Battle of Mount Street Bridge? Or was it tactics or weaponry that helped steer the battle the way it did?
Good question. Two-part question, two-part answer. It was superior tactics. They knew how to establish a defensive position properly. In-depth, segregated. It was very, very well done. As far as the weaponry, it's more, I believe, poor training, poor tactics, and of course, the ability of the volunteers, especially with the Mauser C96, just cut them to pieces. So it's a combination of things, but the most critical thing, I think, was the tactics.
Gotcha. Johnny's smiling. Johnny recognizes one of the photographs he sent you. That was that opposing view of Sackville Street, O'Connell Street, with the opposite view. Now he knows why you were asking.
Yeah.
Daniel was asking as to the effect of handguns of the time. How many survived? And what was the damage to the human body, bearing in mind the caliber that was being used?
Another good question. And again, it's a multi-answer. If you're hit by a 455, it's a slow-moving heavy bullet. You know you're hit. You know you're going down. If there's any kind of good shot placement, and everything with a handgun is shot placement, shot placement, shot placement. Do you hit the guy in the right spot? There's actually a Chicago study done over 10 years where they found that 94% of people involved in gunfights who knew they were hit stopped the attack. They cut off the attack if they knew they were hit. A high velocity handgun has a tendency to go through something, and the person may not know that they're hit. There's a perfect example. An officer I worked with for a while, he had a 357 caliber SIG, very high velocity weapon, was attacked by a man on drugs with a knife. He hit the man 11 times before the attack stopped. Wow. So the reason the model 1911 Colt was designed was because the 38 caliber revolver was inadequate in fighting the Moros in the Philippines. They wanted, again, a slow-moving, very heavy bullet, good shot placement. The attacker goes down.
Okay, I won't go through too many more. I'll ask one more because I think you've pretty much gone through it in the talk. But Paul's highlighting, I guess, that concept that maybe through just high level history, on the rising, and the Helga. So the Helga, you talked about firing on the bridge and Liberty Hall. So I guess Paul's asking, was the GPO left to the mobile gun positions at the top and bottom of O'Connell Street?
Yes, the Helga did not attack the GPO.
Okay.
I've never seen where anyone has said that it did. And the Helga couldn't get up the river any further. And they would have had an observer relay corrections back to them in order to lob shells into the GPO.
Okay. Two things. One, just an opportunity for you, Kieran, to advertise a little bit. The book on the weapons of the Easter Rising, where's it available and what's coming next?
That one is available from Kilmanium Tales TO .ie. And the next book, well, actually, the next book is out. If we ever have a book, get back to Ireland and have a book launch, and that's Weapons of the War of Independence, because there's a lot more weapons involved there. A lot of things stay the same, but some things change. And then for the 100th anniversary of the burning of the Custom House, we have a special pamphlet coming out for weapons at the burning of the Custom House.
Awesome. Awesome. So just before we hang up, just a little bit of advertising for next week. 5 brilliant talks sort of set up every day, 8 o'clock Irish time, 3 o'clock Eastern. On Monday, we have Seaweed and Its Wars by archivist Cahill Dowd Smith. On Tuesday, Daniel Iotis, Commandant Daniel Iotis, is going to talk military archives. On Wednesday, we have Martin Byrne coming back, but to his archaeological roots, astronomical observations at Stone Age sites. On Thursday, Jared Shannon's going to talk about Liam Lynch and upholding the Republic. And then on Friday, I'm pretty much sure we're going to break Zoom. We've got Eddie Lenihan, probably one of the last Shanachis in Ireland, is going to talk about tales from Ireland's fairy forts. And you better come, first serve, because we have a capacity of 3,000 people and there are over 4,000 people already interested or planning on coming on Friday. So it's going to be a hell of a way to finish the week. So thank you, everybody, and catch up with you soon. Okay. God bless.